early October 2015, Emily Carter, a 26-year-old outdoor enthusiast from Boulder, Colorado, arrived at the edge of the San Juan Mountains just after sunrise. The air was thin and cold, the kind that burned your lungs if you breathed too fast. Emily had planned this trip for months. A 3-day solo hike through one of the least traveled trails in the region. Friends later said she loved isolation. Not because she wanted to escape people, but because the mountains made her feel watched over. Before stepping onto the trail, she adjusted her backpack, checked her map one last time, and clipped her GoPro to the strap on her chest. The camera captured everything: her steady footsteps on gravel, the crunch of fallen pine needles, the quiet confidence in her voice as she spoke to it like a diary. She explained the route, joked about the lack of cell service, and mentioned how unusually silent the forest felt that morning. No birds, no wind, just her breathing and the distant creak of trees shifting under their own weight. At one point, she paused and glanced over her shoulder, laughing nervously as she said, "Feels like one of those places where sound just disappears." She brushed it off and kept moving deeper into the woods. By late afternoon, the trail narrowed, trees closing in so tightly that sunlight barely touched the ground. Emily slowed her pace, scanning the terrain more carefully now. The GoPro picked up small details: fresh boot prints that didn't match her own, broken branches that looked recently snapped, and the faint impression of something heavy pressed into the damp soil beside the path. She didn't comment on it, but the way her breathing changed suggested she noticed. The forest around her remained unnaturally still as she continued forward, unaware that this would be the last confirmed footage of her journey into the mountains. When Emily Carter failed to check in by the second night, concern quickly turned into panic. Her family contacted local authorities early the next morning, and within hours, search and rescue teams were deployed into the San Juan Mountains. Rangers retraced her planned route, following the same narrow trail her GoPro had recorded. The deeper they went, the quieter the terrain became. Radios crackled with interference, GPS signals dropped without warning, and several volunteers later reported the unsettling feeling of being watched as they moved through the dense tree line. Emily's campsite was discovered late that evening, less than a mile from where she was last expected to be. Her tent was standing, properly staked and zip closed. Inside, her sleeping bag was neatly laid out, her boots placed beside it as if she had stepped away briefly. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, and no torn equipment. Most disturbing of all, her backpack was still there, along with food, water, and her emergency beacon. The only item missing was her GoPro. Search dogs circled the area repeatedly, then stopped at the tree line, refusing to go any farther. As days turned into weeks, the investigation grew more fragmented. Heavy snowfall erased tracks and altered the landscape, turning familiar ground into something unrecognizable. Officials floated theories: animal attack, accidental fall exposure, but none explained the condition of the campsite or the lack of physical evidence. Tips came in from hikers who claimed to hear voices in the woods, and from locals who warned about sections of forest people avoided without explanation. Over time, resources were pulled, media attention faded, and Emily Carter's name was quietly added to the growing list of missing persons whose stories ended without answers. In the fall of 2022, nearly 7 years after Emily Carter vanished, Mark Reynolds, a lifelong hunter and wilderness guide, ventured into a remote stretch of forest that most locals avoided. The area sat beyond marked trails, a place where trees grew too close together, and the ground stayed damp even in dry seasons. Mark had hunted these mountains for decades, but he later admitted this part of the forest felt different. He said animals rarely passed through, and when they did, they never stayed long. That morning, his tracking led him off his usual route, following a set of elk prints that abruptly ended near a rocky slope. As Mark pushed through the underbrush, something unnatural caught his eye. A dull reflection where no metal should have been. Wedged tightly between two moss-covered rocks was a small, rectangular object coated in layers of dried mud and pine sap. At first, he assumed it was trash left behind by careless hikers, but when he pried it loose, he recognized the shape immediately. It was a GoPro camera, scratched but surprisingly intact. The model looked outdated, and the casing was worn in a way that suggested it had been exposed to the elements for years. Back at his cabin that night, Mark cleaned the device and examined it under a single overhead light. The power button resisted at first, then clicked. To his surprise, a dim red indicator blinked on. The memory card was still inside. When he connected it to his laptop, dozens of files appeared, each stamped with dates he didn't recognize at first. As the first video loaded, the screen filled with the image of a young woman hiking through familiar terrain, unaware that her journey had never truly ended. The first several clips looked ordinary, almost comforting. Emily walked along the trail, narrating small details. The slope of the path, the smell of pine, the way the light shifted between the trees. But as Mark continued watching, subtle changes crept in. The camera began to shake more often. Her footsteps slowed, and the intervals between her spoken words grew longer. In one clip, she stopped completely, the lens fixed on a stretch of forest that looked no different from any other. After several seconds of silence, she whispered, "Did you hear that?" The microphone caught a faint sound in the distance, something between a breath and a step. As the footage progressed, Emily's voice grew tighter, more controlled, as if she were trying not to panic. She started recording in short bursts, sometimes only a few seconds long. In one clip, she angled the camera over her shoulder, scanning the trees behind her. Nothing was visible, yet her breathing became shallow and uneven. She muttered that the footsteps always stopped when she turned around, that whatever it was never showed itself, only moved when she did. The forest itself seemed wrong. Branches swayed without wind, and shadows stretched in ways that didn't match the fading sunlight. The final files were harder to watch. Darkness had fallen, and the GoPro's low light mode distorted the image, turning the forest into a grainy maze of black and gray. Emily crouched behind a tree, barely daring to breathe. Then, from somewhere just beyond the camera's range, came a sound that didn't belong to any animal Mark recognized. A low, deliberate rhythm, like someone matching her breath. In the last visible frame, Emily's face filled the screen, eyes locked on something just behind the camera, her lips parting as if to speak. When Mark turned the footage over to authorities, the response was immediate and unusually quiet. Within hours, 2 unmarked vehicles arrived at his cabin, and the GoPro was sealed inside an evidence bag without explanation. Officials told him the audio glitches and visual distortions were consistent with environmental damage, insisting the footage held no investigative value. Mark noticed how carefully they avoided discussing certain clips, especially the ones recorded at night. He was instructed not to speak about what he'd seen, and the case file connected to Emily Carter was quietly reopened under restricted status. What disturbed Mark most came later, after he had already handed everything over. Before the device was confiscated, he had checked the file metadata out of pure curiosity. Several of the final recordings were not dated in 2015. They were time-stamped just days before his discovery in 2022. That detail never appeared in the official report. When Mark mentioned it, the officer paused too long before responding, then suggested it was likely a system error. Still, Mark remembered how the battery level in the final clip was nearly full. Something that shouldn't have been possible after 7 years in the wilderness. In the weeks that followed, Mark began noticing changes in the forest around his property. Game trails shifted. Night sounds stopped abruptly when he stepped outside. Once, while checking his own trail camera, he found a short video file saved to the memory card, one he didn't remember recording. The clip showed trees swaying in darkness, the camera slowly turning as if guided by an unseen hand. Somewhere in the background, barely audible, a familiar voice whispered a name Mark had never spoken aloud. Authorities officially closed Emily Carter's case for the second time, listing it as an unresolved disappearance. The footage was never released, the GoPro was never returned, and the restricted forest zone remains off limits to this day. No explanations were given, only warnings. But hikers still report strange things in the San Juan Mountains. Cameras malfunction without reason. Footsteps echo where no one is visible, and sometimes, deep in the trees, a faint red light flickers for just a second, like a camera recording. Because whatever followed Emily didn't disappear with her. It learned. It waited. And if you're hearing this story now, there's a chance it wants to be seen again.
If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.